Order, please. And good afternoon and welcome colleagues, invited guests, members of the general public who are following today's proceedings of the Standing Senate Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs. Today we are continuing our consideration of Bill C-16, an act to amend the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code. And with us today for the first hour are Saad, Professor and Chair in Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences and Darwinian Consumption at Concordia University, and Theryn Meyer. Ms. Meyer, thank you both for being with us today. And Professor, I believe you're going to lead off. The floor is yours, sir. 5 minutes. Hope you are aware of that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I have spent 20-plus years working at the nexus of evolutionary psychology and the behavioral sciences, a central feature of which is to explore how evolutionary and biological principles shape our human nature. At the root of this grand objective is the profoundly obvious reality that humans are a sexually reproducing, sexually dimorphic species consisting of reproductively viable males and females. This in no way rejects the equally obvious fact that the rich human tapestry includes other personhoods, such as intersexed and transgendered individuals. Following a 2014 lecture that I delivered at Wellesley College on the thought police, I had a conversation with a student who argued passionately that professors should poll their students at the start of class about their gender identities. While most might have construed her position as outlandish back then, some now consider it too tame. Take the Office of BGLTQ Student Life at Harvard University, who recently distributed a flyer to combat transphobia, wherein it was stated that one's gender identity and gender expression could change daily, and that, quote, fixed binaries and biological essentialism constitute transphobic misinformation that is tantamount to systemic violence. Was the Wellesley student transphobic since she did not potentially consider the daily fluidity of one's gender identity? What about minute-to-minute changes? Should professors poll their students every 10th minute of every lecture to find out if their gender identities have changed since last asked? Should academics no longer design surveys wherein a participant's biological sex is measured as a binary variable? Would this be transphobic systemic violence, since it perpetuates fixed binaries and biological essentialism? Facebook and New York City allow 50 plus and 31 genders respectively as part of one's profile. Should professors develop surveys that recognize all of these genders? Would it be systemically violent to not do so? Should evolutionists no longer explain how sexual selection works, namely the fundamental process by which sex differences evolve? This mechanism recognizes two sexes, and hence it might, quote, disenfranchise those who reject fixed binaries and biological essentialism. Bottom line, foundational tenets of evolution might be construed as might be construed as legal transgressions under Bill C-16. So evolution itself might be a transgression. Ongoing governmental efforts are pushing for a gender-neutral society to cater to an extraordinarily small number of non-binary or non-gendered people who feel marginalized at having to provide their biological sex as part of their profiles. This is the tyranny of the minority. 99% of the population should acquiesce to having a default feature of their personhood erased because a few individuals might be inconvenienced by it. The slippery slope of totalitarian lunacy awaits us. Some are now proposing that racial categories constitute, quote, biological essentialism, and instead we should respect racial self-identities. This is known as transracialism, as per Rachel Dolezal, who was born white but who self-identifies as black. How long before the government tables legislation to combat bigotry against the transracial? What about fat phobia? There are many more Canadians who are overweight than transgendered, and the collective abuse that they experience is sizable. Should the government legislate such hate? The road to hell is indeed paved with good intentions. As someone who escaped religious persecution in Lebanon and whose parents were kidnapped in Beirut, I fully support the protection of all individuals from institutional discrimination. That said, I am weary of the ethos of victimhood that has parasitized our culture. The operative motto is not, I think, therefore I am, but I am a victim, therefore I am. I refer to this condition as collective Munchausen, namely the pathological quest for sympathy and empathy by proclaiming victim status using identity politics and intersectionality. People have the right to live as equal citizens under the law. They do not have the right to demand that their identities be coddled and celebrated, lest they might otherwise get offended. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Meyer?
My name is Theryn Meyer. I provide cultural commentary in written format and on YouTube with a focus on contemporary transgender issues. As a trans woman myself, I take advantage of the freedom of speech that this amazing country has granted me to argue for tolerance and understanding from my fellow man, and to explore how best to negotiate the integration of my transgender brothers and sisters into society. I don't believe there to be any other sustainable, effective method to achieving these goals other than to speak up as individuals and make the case for it, which is exactly why I sit in front of you today. An act to amend the Human Rights Act and Criminal Code threatens the very process by which individual voices inspire change in a democratic society. And in turn, Bill C-16 ultimately works against the very group it's been advertised to protect. Before you accept the bill's purported purpose of equal protection for trans and gender non-conforming people under the law, consider the statements made by the sponsor of the bill, Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, Jody Wilson-Raybould. After conceding that the open-endedness of the term identifiable group within the criminal code already protects trans people under the law, Minister Wilson-Raybould admits that the purpose of her proposed bill is not so much to legally enshrine the protection of trans people, but instead to send a clear message. Quote, with the bill, we unequivocally say that Canada can do better. We say loudly and clearly that it is time to move beyond mere tolerance of trans people. It is time for their full acceptance and inclusion. It will promote inclusion and respect for trans people. Equal rights for trans persons should not be hidden, but be plain for all to see. End quote. This does not sound like equal protection under the law. This sounds like Canada's most influential lawyer and her cronies playing the role of social justice activists with their political power. And then the final quote from Minister Wilson-Raybould, quote, some of the words and concepts used in the discussion on Bill C-16 may not be familiar to all Canadians, end quote. Another unequivocal confirmation that the bill is not attempting to amend the law in response to a cultural shift, as it should work in a democratic society, but that the bill seeks instead to work in the reverse, using the force of law to intimidate Canadians and then branding it as promoting social change. Besides being anti-democratic and anti-free speech in nature, the idea that Bill C-16 will inspire a better Canada for trans people is a dangerous delusion, as it will do the exact opposite. The definitions for gender identity and gender expression that the bill's supporters have proposed, one is something subjective and unverifiable existing purely in the mind, and the other as being nothing more than fashion sense, are sure to breed a climate of hypersensitivity where people feel they need to walk on eggshells or even outright avoid trans people in fear of prosecution. Because of this, trans and gender non-conforming people will likely lose job opportunities, as employers would avoid employing what would become a serious legal liability for them. And Bill C-16 risks perpetuating the already low economic standing of trans people. The bill will also send the impression to Canadians that trans people are too weak to defend and make the case for their identities in a free society, and that the only way for us to exist amongst others is to restrict by draconian law the freedoms of others. By turning us into a source of hypersensitivity, a legal liability, and a group whose existence is contingent on the undue restriction of everyone else's freedom, Bill C-16 is a sure way to engender resentment, intolerance, and true transphobia that will derail the process of acceptance and integration of trans people and keep us relegated to the margins of society. If you truly care about trans and gender non-conforming people, about our lives, and about our livelihood, you will vote against Bill C-16. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both witnesses. And we'll move to questions now, beginning with the Deputy Chair of the Committee, Senator Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for your presentations. The overriding question that comes to mind after listening to your presentations is this. Every Canadian province and territory, except one, I think, has in law, in their human rights codes, they have gender identity, and in most of them gender expression as well. Others have gender. And this has worked very well. I read case law on a daily basis. I've done it for 50 years. And I can't identify a single case in which that legislation has not worked to everybody's satisfaction. So how do you answer that question? I mean, this is not something new. This is something that has been expected for many years because it forms a part of a much larger area of law, and that is at the provincial and territorial level.
I can't speak to the legal issues. I mean, what really I care to focus on is as a working scientist and as a professor who specializes in evolutionary behavioral sciences, there are endless cases where both in the pursuit of my pedagogy, where I'm teaching students, or in the pursuit of my research, I would be skirting with legal transgressions of Bill C-16 if this bill were to pass. So I can't really speak about all the legal ramifications. All I can say is that I've seen my good friend Jordan Peterson, who I think will be testifying next week, what happened to him at University of Toronto, and I can assure you that that would only be the tip of the spear. And so we have to be careful as to, on the one hand, ensuring that, of course, all people should live free of hate and discrimination, but also, how do you actually materialize these realities? I mean, if literally I were to walk into class and explain, as I mentioned in my opening statements, the fundamental mechanism of evolution, which is sexual selection and natural selection, that itself would be considered transphobic. According to Harvard University, biological essentialism and fixed binaries is a form of systemic violence, to repeat what I said. So now, can I go into my class and teach evolutionary theory? Or would I be engaging in systemic violence against the transgendered? So this is something that, as a professor, concerns me.
I still don't understand where your logic lies, because we already have that law. I mean, education and what's said in our universities and our schools comes under the human rights codes of the provinces. In the human rights codes of the provinces, gender identity is there, gender expression is there. Yes, there's an addition to the criminal code, but we have the provisions in the criminal code that have been clearly identified by the Supreme Court of Canada in Keegstra, 1990. So I can't see where your concern lies and has any justification in our laws as they've been applied today, which covers these very expressions.
Do you want me to respond? So again, I really don't know. I can't speak about the legal issues. Harvard University, a rather prestigious university, is arguing that to argue that something is due to biological essentialism is a form of transphobia. Well, my whole field, all of evolutionary biology and all of evolutionary psychology, would then be committing that systemic violence. So what would I do? What would you suggest for me to do when I walk into class next fall and I wish to teach about sexual selection, which is the mechanism that explains how traits and behaviors evolve across the two sexes? Would that be transphobic? Would that be something that I'm allowed to do or not? I don't know. I can't speak to the legality. I'll defer to your legal expertise. Could the government place me under illegal transgression if this were to pass?
No.
No?
No.
Okay. No.
So then Harvard would be wrong then by proclaiming.
Okay, Senator Platt.
I am glad that we have a lot of judges here who will sit on the bench and rule on this after. To both of our guests, thank you very much for being here. Senator Baker has been wanting to get into the legal weeds here, and we have lawyers coming next week, so I will leave the legal questions for them, and I'm sure they will have good answers. I will focus my questions more on the science and ideology surrounding this legislation and the possible implications, and I would like you both to take note of these questions and answer them. And you've already talked about Jordan Peterson, but Jordan Peterson was on TV's The Agenda with Steve Paikin, among other academics, which they were discussing, where they were discussing this bill. And Theryn, I think you were part of that great discussion. There is a professor of transgenderism studies from the University of Toronto who stated in that debate, and I quote, "There is no such a thing as biological sex." Now, for the sake of time, he said, for the sake of time, he didn't want to unpack this at length for the viewers. However, he said this was not his opinion. He said that for 50 years, science has proven this. So I would like to get both of your comments on this. And secondly, as an academic, certainly Dr. Saad and Theryn, if you have any comments, do you find it troubling that Jordan Peterson received 2 warning letters from the university because of his perspective on Bill C-16 and particularly in pronouns, but that this comment, no such a thing as biological sex, the same university who houses a biology department is completely silent?
I guess I don't need this. Yes, it troubles me very much. The reason I'm here is because I have witnessed firsthand the unprecedented ideological motivations behind the terms being used, the way they're used, and the way they're defined. I'm not sure what it means that the case law in these provinces have worked just fine. In whose favour have they worked just fine? Because I am aware of the ideological motivations, unprecedented compared to any of the other listed groups in these pieces of law, I think that putting it into federal legislation is a step in the wrong direction. I don't really see why we have to make the problem worse because it's worked. In fact, it has worked quite well. I'm not even sure what that means because I've spoken to lawyers myself who say the exact opposite, that it's dangerous, that it's draconian, and that people have suffered. Even if they didn't get jail time, or even if they didn't get fined, the fact that that the whole process can occur is a problem because that is in itself already traumatizing.
Thank you. Dr. Saad.
To speak to Dr. Peterson's debacle, look, I gave a lecture at the Banning Conference a few months ago where I simply read testimonies that I received, first-hand testimonies from students, from professors, and from the parents of students, where they share with me the stifling environment that they are experiencing at universities, where they are afraid to utter a single syllable out of place, lest somebody might be offended. If I were to read these testimonies here before you in this chamber, you would think that these were testimonies coming out of North Korea. So a free society, as somebody who comes from the Middle East, who has probably experienced more persecution than most of the people put together here in this room, I don't want our universities and our places of thought to be so stifled. So that which Jordan Peterson experienced would have been something that none of us could have envisioned a few years ago, and yet now we are seeing it. I get tons of my colleagues who write to me and say, geez, thank God that there's somebody like you who has the, forgive the term, testicular fortitude to speak out, because we don't have it, and we're terrified of our students, we're terrified of our colleagues, and so that kind of environment is unbecoming of Canada, and I should know what I speak of, having come from a place where these freedoms are not readily available to us.
Thank you. If there's a second round, though.
All right, thank you. Senator Jaffer.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to both of you for being here. I've listened to you very carefully. I have a question for you, Professor. You and I probably come from same backgrounds. The provincial code and the federal code, when it comes to my race, if somebody discriminates against me, a person of color, I feel very empowered in this country because I have codes, both provincial and federal. If I'm not given a job because of my color, if I cannot rent a place because of my color, I'm protected. So for me, it's a natural step that if there is a group of people who come in front of us and say that because that they are transgender, they are finding it difficult to get a job, they are finding it difficult to rent a place, and they need the protection of the Human Rights Code. I, as a parliamentarian, think I have that protection. How can I deny that protection to them?
So as I said, I strongly support that we all live free of discrimination and hate and bigotry. My concern are precisely the ones that are pushed to the envelope, like the examples that I gave in my prepared statement, like the example of Jordan Peterson. In the case of Jordan Peterson, he wasn't arguing, I'm a landlord and I won't allow you to live in my apartment because you're transgendered. He almost got fired as a tenured professor at the University of Toronto because he refused to acquiesce to using new pronouns, gzir and gzay and their in singular form. So the examples that I'm offering you, those examples at the boundary, where if I walk into class and teach about evolution, I might be transgressing Bill C-16, that's what interests me. You and I are in agreement that transgendered people should not be discriminated in all of the ways that you and I would agree. But the devil is in the details. My whole field, evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology, would be one gargantuan transgression of Bill C-16 as per the examples that I read for you. And that's something that we need to address.
And so, and that's why it's, sorry. And that's why we have to have that, you know, what you brought up is very important. It's a dialogue we should have. Free speech is very important. And, you know, hopefully we can continue with this dialogue. But in front of us here is to amend, to add to the Human Rights Code and also to the Criminal Code, to protect rights of transgender people, the basic rights that you and I both enjoy. And that's what this bill is about. And so that's what, and so you and I both agree that that protection should be there, right?
To those basic rights. But if you're going to ask me to poll students every 10 minutes to find out if your gender identity has changed.
I didn't even know you do that. So.
Well, Harvard thinks so.
Well, we're not at Harvard,
well,
thank God. This is Canada.
The student at Wellesley thought so. And so what happens when the student comes along and says, look, I'll expect you to follow my gender fluctuations throughout the semester. Today I'd like to be called he, tomorrow she, tomorrow. It sounds as though I'm being facetious, but I'm not, right? These are recorded instances. So I'm just saying that we have to be careful.
It's important you raise that, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Senator Dagenet. Oh, very briefly, please.
I would just like to add that the laws that the bill seeks to amend already does protect trans people under the law, because the term identifiable group applies to trans people. We are very identifiable. And it has been used before these provincial legislations included gender identity and gender expression. Trans people have used when they felt they were discriminated against because they're trans. They have used identifiable group for that. I understand it's a symbolic gesture. It's not pragmatic. This is symbolic. It's supposed to say something about Canada. I get that. But it's like nuking an inconvenient beaver dam. You're solving a fairly small problem, meaning we don't symbolically gesture at that trans people should be accepted in the law. By broadening it vastly, it's not justified.
Senator Dagenet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses.
Madame Meyer, la question est pour vous. On sait que les lois...
Ms. Meyer, the question is for you. We know that the legislation isn't perfect, and we're here to improve it. Is the system working? Do you hear me? You should be on channel 2. Channel 2. Channel 1 is English, channel 2 is French. As I was saying, laws are not perfect, but here we're trying to improve them through the testimony that we have. In your view, what would be the consequences of this bill if some parts of it were ignored or taken out in the drafting? Channel 1 is English. Channel 1 is English. Channel 1 is in English. The English is Channel 1. The English is Channel 1.
It's okay. Est-ce que vous m'entendez bien?
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Can you hear me in English? Can you hear what I'm saying in English? Or we can always try it in Italian. Can you hear? This is the English channel. This is the English channel. All right. Well, there we are. So I'll repeat my question. I was saying that legislation is never perfect, and we try to improve them through the experience of our witnesses. In your view, what would be the consequences of this bill, the impact of this bill, if we were to remove some of its components in drafting it?
Yes, I agree that legislation isn't perfect, and there is a lot of reason to keep definitions somewhat open-ended so that they can be interpreted without undue restriction in real-life cases. So I would say that there is a possibility to amend this bill, change some of the terminology used, or maybe commit to some more rigorously defined terms. But I think that would have to mean that we should maybe start from square one. I see something like, instead of gender identity and gender expression, something like transsexual status, because at least that can be corroborated by a doctor. At least you have that. I mean, that's a good start. It's not just something that exists in your mind and that you can change at whim.
Merci. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Dupuy. Thank you. You've just answered my question. I had one for you, and it was exactly that one. Would the words, or would transsexual and transgender be more acceptable? It seems that you would say yes.
That's a good start. I'll have to see what the conversation around that is, but that's definitely a step in the right direction.
Ma question pour le témoin professeur.
My question for Professor Saad. Professor Saad, if I understand correctly, you teach at Concordia University. Could you tell us whether you have experimented either for the institution or for your colleagues or for individual professors through the expression of policies that don't allow you to be free in the way you teach, or through sanctions or warnings? Have you ever experienced such a thing? Secondly, can you give us some references to papers you have written, perhaps, on the issue before us, or to the works of other researchers that you may know that would help us go more deeply into this topic?
I must say that generally Concordia has been a very welcoming place, but recently I've started feeling some hints of problems that might arise. So, for example, I was hoping to organize a Freedom Summit, and I announced it on my very popular channel, a Freedom Summit where I would invite professors who are at the forefront of fighting for freedom of speech. And an administrator came to me and said that I can't use, I'm a chaired professor, I have a university-wide chair, and he said that I can't use this money to organize this meeting because it doesn't correspond to my scientific research, so that while the university broadly supports freedom of speech, my organizing a Freedom Summit did not fit within the mandate of my chair. I found that a bit suspicious. The other thing that I would say is that I used to consistently be on the front pages of the media department at Concordia, and recently it seems as though they have misplaced my profile. So that, for example, when now I was coming to testify here in front of the Senate, and when I'm later speaking in front of parliamentarians about some of my research, no one tweeted this. In the past, they would certainly have been at the forefront of promoting my work. So it seems as though while they haven't systematically sought to limit my freedom of speech, it seems that maybe I might be angering some folks that might not be happy with my outspokenness. So that speaks to your first question. Your second question regarding some of the research I do, I founded a discipline called evolutionary consumption, which basically I apply evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology to study consumer behavior. So I study things like how hormones affect men and women's behaviors. I study a wide range of sex differences in mating behavior, and gift-giving behavior, and shopping behavior. So my work is at the intersection of biology, psychology, and consumer behavior. And so it's in that capacity as an evolutionary behavioral scientist that I'm here testifying.
Okay. Senator Boisvenu.
Monsieur le Président, alors,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our two witnesses for being here today. Ms. Meyer. I'm still somewhat ambivalent about this bill because, in my view, a bill should redress a situation where there is a genuine problem. I was sure that Canadian law appropriately covered transgender rights. And it's interesting to hear you because this bill isn't for us or for university professors. It's designed for you who experience the problems. So my first question is this. Given that laws do leave judges broad discretion in regard to your rights, do you believe that this bill will not, or do you fear that this bill will create false hope in transgender people?
I do, and I did make statements as to how I believe that this bill will hurt trans people more, and I think it just takes a little bit of conscientious thought and a little bit of just thinking it through in the long run that I don't see this actually helping. And yes, of course, I've experienced discrimination because I'm trans, but I'm also speaking as someone who came from South Africa. This is an amazing country, and I worry that the freedoms that I have been given is actually being taken away by this bill, specifically my freedom of speech.
But in your situation, I'd like you to tell me in a really tangible way, how will this bill actually serve as a barrier or a step back from existing legislation?
Or a step back?
Yeah.
As I said, it's not going to protect trans and gender non-conforming people any more or any less, but it will broaden the law to a point where, as I said, my freedom of speech as a trans person, Canadians' freedom of speech will be set back in a way that concerns me. And I'm also speaking, as I said, from someone who has gone to university, who has interacted with the kind of people who talk about things like gender identity and gender expression and define it in the way that Minister Wilson-Raybould, the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and proponents of this bill have defined these terms. And it worries me because, well, as I said, gender expression it becomes nothing more than fashion sense. So someone who feels discriminated because they look too alternative could say that, me having tattoos and piercings is actually part of my gender expression. And so if you don't want to employ me in a nice restaurant because I have tattoos and piercings, you're discriminating to me based on my gender expression. It's just, as I said, it's just too broad. So that's...
Merci beaucoup.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
So when Senator Dupuy asked you the question, so thank you very much, both of you, for your testimony. I was listening carefully, Ms. Meyer, when you were speaking about the issues you're concerned. And at first I thought one of the issues might be the penalty provisions, but you've indicated it's predominantly the definition. Or did you look at the penalty provisions as well? Or?
Yes, I did. Okay. So my main concern is the terms being used, the nomenclature behind it, the language that has been proposed in the definitions. And so I'm not in principle against, as I said, some symbolic gesture to protect trans and gender non-conforming people, but it needs to be something that doesn't compromise the law and our freedoms as much as this could. And as I've spoken, something like transsexual status, it's a lot more kind of verifiable by a third party. Yeah. So.
Okay. Senator Sinclair.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Saad, I listened carefully to your explanation about your
professional expertise in the area of research that you do, and I don't see it connected to this issue in the same way maybe that you do. Your presentation, quite frankly, primarily was on the issue of political correctness and limitations on freedom of expression, as I understood it. So I began my question with you being aware of that. So I was thinking as I was listening to what you were saying that you're very strong on ensuring that one's freedom of expression is not limited by laws such as this. And yet, you didn't express any concern, from what I could gather, on the issue of the discrimination that is going to occur and is occurring with regard to employment, accommodation, housing, military benefits, pension benefits, all of the other things that trans people are not going to be receiving if laws preventing that discrimination from occurring are not put in place. Are you not concerned about preventing that discrimination?
I'm fully concerned, as I conceded to the senator earlier. I'm sorry, I think Senator Jaffer. And she conceded that we seem to be in agreement that we have to protect transgendered people from exactly the cases that you're talking about. But that's not the world I live in. I'm not a landlord who may or may not discriminate against the transgendered. I'm a professor who does research on sex differences. I'm a professor who applies evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology in my work and in my teaching. And so therefore, it's not a question of just political correctness. If I get up in front of the class and I talk about how there are evolutionary pressures that result in sexual differences between males and females, could somebody who is in the class and who is transgendered argue that you did not incorporate my personhood in your lecture, and as such I felt disenfranchised and marginalized, and therefore you're engaging in some sort of bias? What if one of my students, as part of their research project, writes one of the questions, are you male or female? Would that be a form of systemic violence against the transgendered because we didn't include 31 genders? This is not facetiousness. This is real, concrete examples as per what Jordan Peterson went through. So I would like to receive some assurances as to what extent does this bill go? How far does it go? I don't have the legal training that many of the folks do here, so I can't speak to that. But in reading the bill, I could see many places where my simply getting up in front of the class would constitute one big transgression, and I'm worried about that.
Thank you. Senator Batters.
Thanks very much, both of you, for coming today. Ms. Meyer, we've had mothers of transgender children here last week, and they've talked about the terrible bullying that their children had endured. And we've been told that this policy and this bill needs to be enacted because, among other things, it will help protect these children from bullying and because suicide rates are high among the transgender community. Given that similar legislation has existed in many provinces now for many years, 2012 in Ontario, why has this failed to stop the bullying and discrimination and negative outcomes and, for example, help to reduce suicide rates that we're hearing about? So do you think that this, introducing a bill like this federally, will change those outcomes?
Usually the people who bully trans kids are other kids. I was bullied. I wouldn't want people who bullied me being charged with a hate crime or have to go to the a human rights tribunal. So I don't believe that a legislation like that we're talking about here has anything to do with that. The suicide rates, I think that people are inferring a causation where there is at best a correlation. A lot of trans people suffer from gender dysphoria, which in itself is a diagnosable mental illness. That has to be taken into account, the fact that a lot of trans people have an actual mental illness. You can't just say that, well, trans kids at school are being bullied, therefore enact a law that broadens the law so much that everyone, all of our freedom of speech is completely, jettisoned. I would have to see some more concrete evidence as to causation.
Thank you. And as a trans woman who is opposed to this particular bill, have you received any, what has been the feedback? I would imagine there's been some negative feedback that you've received in your own trans community because of the position you've publicly expressed?
I have a hard time understanding the idea of a trans community. It's a very odd kind of thing to link a bunch of people together. I have spoken to mothers of trans kids. In fact, one of them spoke here. I forget her name, but we spoke about it, and I shared with her my concerns, and she seemed to be understood where I came from. Yes, I haven't received too much hate mail.
That's good.
Yeah, so I guess that's the answer.
Right. Thank you very much for coming.
Senator Joel.
Mr. Chair, and thank you for your contribution. Sometimes you have to go to the other extreme to understand where lies the medium ground. And I tell you, when I read again Bill C-16 that you have asked us to vote against, to use the word that Ms. Meyer has asked in their concluding remarks, you know, Bill C-16 is essentially to prevent, promoting genocide of transgender people. I mean, you're telling me today that I should vote against preventing somebody to advocate killing a person, older person, who happens to declare themselves transgender. I tell you, I have a problem with that. You know, transgender people are human people, and I think it should be prevented from any human being to advocate the killing of another one because that person identifies as gay or not gay or heterosexual or transgender. I mean, this is about genocide. Read section 17, 718. So, 318. I have 318. Sorry, 318. So, I have some problems of reconcilier. I mean, to put together the value of a human life with the right to life that person, because it is a human person, and that person declare themselves of one sex or another, whatever sex, and this bill says you have to protect the life of that person, whatever is the identity or the claim identity of that person. You ask me to vote against this. I have a moral problem with your request today. I tell you, at least in relation to that section of the bill, it's section 3 of the bill, I think. It's the back of this page. Let me see. Section 3. Section 3 of the bill. This is what the bill asks, Professor Saad. You come from Lebanon. I mean, religious war, therefore, I've seen that country being torn down on religious ground. Less serious causes of killing somebody than genocide. So I have a moral problem when somebody asks me to accept that we would promote genocide of a transgender person on the only basis that that person claims is a transgender. But if I advocate the genocide of gay people, I would be prevented to do that. But to do that for transgender would be fine. I mean, where is the value of a human life in relation to your position? I have some problem with that. I can understand there are problems, practical problems, how we identify the right and the left and the middle and so forth. I totally agree with you. We can discuss that. But on the very principle of this bill, to advocate the genocide of transgender people, that's what this bill promotes.
Witnesses an opportunity.
Yeah, I'm sorry to get carried by your position.
So perhaps I read the bill too late at night and I was tired, but I didn't get the feeling that when I read the bill that it only dealt with genocide. Because if it dealt only with genocide, I would probably be in a better position to argue for that protection, since I come from Lebanon and I'm a Jewish person. So I probably know about religious persecution much more than you do. But I didn't get the feeling that this bill was only about genocide. When Jordan Peterson was when people were trying to get Jordan Peterson fired from the University of Toronto as a highly esteemed psychologist, it's not because he was arguing for the genocide of transgendered people. It's because he argued that I don't wish to have someone impose upon me the pronoun by which I should be addressed. And I gave you numerous other examples whereby, in my own understanding of the bill, I would be in transgression of that bill because I would be exhibiting bias towards the transgendered. By arguing, for example, for sex differences when it comes to mating behavior and not recognizing the panoply of other personhoods, I would be engaging in systemic violence. So I don't need to be lectured about the importance of genocide. No reasonable person would support such a possibility. But I'm not here to argue for genocide. I'm here to argue about the details that got Jordan Peterson into hot water and would likely get me in hot water.
Ms. Meyer, do you want to briefly respond?
Yes, I would like to add that Bill C-16 is not just about genocide and, you know, the idea of, well, we need to add this because someone may advocate genocide towards trans people. Well, first, transgender or even transsexual, none of those are mentioned in the bill. It's gender identity and gender expression. I've already made very clear why I don't like those terms. Where are we going to stop? Should we include, you know, weight of people? Should we include fashion sense of people, which we already will with gender expression? I mean, where will we draw the line that, you know, because I can divide the world into as many subgroups and identities as I want and then advocate for genocide towards one of them. People who wore teal.
Thank you. I'm struggling with which question to ask, and I'm going to try and take it in a different direction. Either one of you, and I don't remember who, said that gender expression and gender identity is in the mind, and you can't regulate and codify what's in the mind. Well, I would say that religion is in the heart, in the spirit, in the mind. And yet we provide protection to people, and you know, you've spoken about religious persecution. We provide protection to people who practice for the practice of their religions. So I'm having a hard time figuring out this notion that human rights are only to be expressed in expressions of tangible identity. And you mentioned transsexuals. You can get it checked. You can get it verified, validated with the doctor. I'm just wondering what your response to my trouble with this position is.
Yes, well, I don't believe gender identity is something that exists only in the mind, but that is how I'm saying that the term has been defined by the Ontario Human Rights Code, which has set that precedent, by Minister Wilson-Raybould, who is the sponsor of this bill, has defined it as something that exists only in the human mind. Now, not in so much words. She said it's one's subjective sense of being a man, a woman, both or neither. That is internally contradictory. It is vastly broad. And once again, like religion, at least you can say, people congregate as a religion, they pray. There are churches and mosques. It is not something that exists purely in the mind. Maybe something like spirituality is. So I don't think that there are necessarily comparable in the way that gender identity thus far has been defined.
May I ask another question? Thank you. It's in a different stream. Will you allow that? So I want to ask you a question about this concern that both of you have, but I think Ms. Meyer more has around rights creep. Today, gendered expression, tomorrow, people who wear teal. But the history of human rights in this country, which you have come to and enjoy the freedoms of as I have, has been a history of expansion of human rights, first of women, then of, when I came, it was impossible to think that gays would be protected under the Human Rights Code, and yes, they are, and the world hasn't gone ballistic, and then it went on and on. So I wonder if you can compare, you can comment on the what I would say as the civil and civilized expansion of human rights under the Canadian Human Rights Code with your notion of limitations on it. Can you project that one day there will be other identities today? Can you limit that today?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question, but I will answer in the way that I think I'm for protecting trans people, even if it's just symbolically, even if we already protect trans people. I'm for that, but there needs to be some prudence, some conscientiousness, as I said, and this bill does not do that. So yeah, and in the past, in history, it's always been a push-pull between liberals and conservatives so that we move forward without falling off of the cliff.
Can I answer?
Yes, please.
May I?
Yes.
I think in my opening remarks, towards the end, I mentioned two cases that speak to your question. I mentioned the transracial, so people now who proclaim that even though I am white, I self-identify as black. That's transracialism. It's a real thing. And I gave the example of so-called fat phobia, right? A much greater number of Canadians are overweight, and if we were to collectively measure the pain that they experience in terms of the daily bigotry and discrimination that they face, you're going to get a lot of bigger bang for the buck in terms of reducing discrimination if you actually pass legislation against fat-phobic people. Would that be something that we should do?
Okay, we'll have to move on. Senator Mitchell.
Thank you. I'd like to address the answer of Mr. Saad that has touched a number of times on Mr. Peterson's concern. The point's made that his job was threatened. He makes that point. That may be the case, and nobody's job should be threatened. But it's very interesting that somebody in your position and his position have tenure, he has resources, he has stature with which he has defended his job. But trans people lose their jobs, don't get jobs, and far, far worse, all the time. Violent discrimination, continual harassment. And they don't very often have tenure, and they don't very often have resources, and they don't very often, or often they don't have stature. So why is it that you can't understand somehow that all C-16 does, without in any way, shape, or form threatening you and all of the advantages that you have in our society, all it does is even the playing field by giving some protections and giving some acceptance to one of the most discriminated against and vulnerable groups of people in our society. Isn't it just quintessentially Canadian that we should extend that reach of warmth and embrace and protection to people who desperately need it?
If the bill is written in a way that it does exactly what you're saying and nothing else, and that it protects against the gray zone areas that I spoke of, then it would be a no-brainer for me to support that. As I mentioned in my opening statements, again, given my personal history, few people are in a better position to argue for why everyone should be protected, irrespective of their personhood. So you're preaching to the choir. I'm here to simply serve as the canary in the coal mine, or whatever the expression is, to say that there are details that we have to be careful about, and I share with you my details as a professor. It has nothing to do with me being tenured or being privileged. It has to do with the very real possibility that someone could come along and say, the way you're teaching your course is marginalizing me, change it, or else you're biased.
Well, a lot of what you argue is, in defense of your position, is extremely hypothetical. But we actually have a hypothetical that has been tested. We have an hypothesis in your case that has been directly tested. You are saying that your course will be or could be declared transphobic if this bill is passed. But your course is under Quebec legislation. Quebec legislation has had gender identification protected for a number of years under Section 10 of the Quebec Charter, and it has never happened. You are still teaching that course, and nobody is accused or in an official way it of being a transphobic course. So why would it be that C-16, that won't cover your jurisdiction where you teach at all, why would it make your case that somehow it's going to result in your course being declared transphobic? And remember, you keep repeating that you're not a lawyer, so I'm not at all certain how you could effectively make the statements that you're making.
I could speak about the general atmosphere in the trenches of academia. And so because of that, I could hypothesize the trajectory of victimhood that stifles people from speaking. I gave the example of the endless, innumerable testimonies that I received that should make every senator in this room feel very, very bad that I would be receiving such emails. And so from that perspective, perhaps, again, I'm wrong legally in that whatever you said is absolutely correct. That doesn't mean, though, that it's not something that we should be worried about. I live in the trenches of academia, and I see how terrified my colleagues are of uttering a single word out of place lest someone will be offended. That's wrong, and we should stop it.
People in this room live in the
We've
trenches
come to an
of
end here, and thank you,
transphobia.
witnesses, very much for your appearance here this evening and for your contribution to our deliberations. We're going to suspend briefly. order, please. Joining us for our second hour are Meghan Murphy, and from the Woman Means Something campaign, Paul Dirks, and from the Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter, Hilla Kerner, who's a collective member. Thank you for joining us. You have up to 5 minutes each for an opening statement, and we'll begin with Ms. Kerner.
Transgender people must live in safety and have the equal rights and opportunities that are promised to us all. We have no doubt that people whose behavior is not consistent with a tyrannical, socially imposed definition of manhood or womanhood, including transgender people, suffer condemnation, discrimination, and violence. Women have been punished since the dawn of patriarchy for disobeying the suffocating constrictions of girlhood and womanhood. For Canadians, the Montreal Massacre is an extreme example of the punishment of women who dare to reach beyond educational and professional norms for women at the time. All over the world, women are punished for having abortions and for not submitting to compulsory heterosexuality and choosing lesbianism. Women and their children are living in our own shelter because these women's husbands are threatening to kill them for breaking up the marriage. Whenever women challenge the gender straitjacket that maintains our subordination, we risk punishment. We are worried that well-intentioned legislation will be used to undermine the rights of women and the crucial work of women's groups to serve and organize with female-born women. From birth, through our girlhood and womanhood, we are treated differently. That treatment constitutes our oppression. Female-born women and people who were born male and self-identify as women have different life experiences. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it means to feel like a woman. I know what it is to be a girl and to be a woman and the experiences and the feelings I have because I'm a woman. My experiences is reflected in the experiences of women who call us. We know the embarrassment of having our clothes stained with blood from our period, the anxiety of facing an unwanted pregnancy, and the fear of being raped. We know the horror of being raped, and we know the comfort of grouping with other women. We connect the personal individual experience of how we are treated as girls and women to the collective political reality of women's oppression. To the specifics of Bill C-16 and the use of the terms gender identity and gender expression. There is no social consensus on what these terms mean. We, like other feminists, use the term gender to mean the socially imposed division of the sexes. Simone de Beauvoir wrote in The Second Sex, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman," and that it is a destiny imposed on her by her teacher and by society. We understand that the authors of the bill use the term gender to describe an internal feeling or state of mind that can be consistent or inconsistent with one sex. Some say that these internal feelings are innate and some say they are fluid. And therefore, in this concept, living out one's true gender identity is supposed to be liberating, not confining. Similarly, the use of the term gender expression in the bill means how a person publicly presents their gender. This can include behaviors and outward appearance such as dress, hair, makeup. In our understanding, gender expression describes the behaviors that oppress and control women. That includes men's violence against women. Males are not inherently violent. Men are violent because of the social construction of masculinity and manhood. In this context, rape is a gender expression. Clearly, this is a very controversial issue, and not just in Canada. We have barely achieved formal equality rights for women, let alone change the reality of women's lives. And we are asked to concede to a concept and legal applications that contradict the core understanding of women's oppression which is a starting point of our fight for our liberation. We are calling on the Senate to apply sober second thought. We must have legislation that protect both the equality interest of women and the equality rights of transgender people. We urge the Senate to expand the study of the bill to allow full discussion, serious and complicated thinking, and careful nuanced articulation that will result in legislation that reflects the noble promise of protection and advancement of equality for all. Thank you.
Ms. Murphy?
So, a key problem with this bill is that it proposes to amend something as important as the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code in order to include something that isn't even definable. According to Justice Canada, gender identity is defined as a person's internal or individual experience of their gender. But this definition misunderstands what gender is. Gender is not about internal or individual experiences. It's a social construction. It exists as a means to reinforce stereotypes and oppressive ideas about men and women. Gender does not mean male or female, it means masculine or feminine. A century ago, gender determined that women should not be allowed to vote or be counted as persons under the law in Canada. Gender says that men are inherently violent, aggressive, independent, assertive, and rational, whereas women are inherently passive, delicate, nurturing, irrational, and emotional. These ideas have been disproved thanks in large part to the feminist movement. Yet today, in creating and supporting the idea that one can have an internal gender identity, we are regressing. No one is born with a gender. We are born male or female, and gender is then imposed on us through socialization. Women do not know they are women because they are born interested in high heels or the color pink. They know they are women because they are female. Treating gender as though it is either internal or a personal choice is dangerous and completely misunderstands how and why women are oppressed under patriarchy as a class of people. Patriarchy was invented in order to control women's reproductive capacity, and gender was created in order to naturalize and reinforce that hierarchical system. Women and girls around the world are killed, prostituted, raped, and abused every single day, not because they wear dresses, have long hair, or behave passively, but because they are female. And under patriarchy, females are said to be less than, things that exist for male use, to be owned, bought, sold, and looked at. Women's rights exist on this basis, because we as a society understand that women are discriminated against and subjected to male violence regardless of their clothing, body language, or behavior, which is now apparently being defined as gender expression. The idea that women could simply express themselves or identify differently in order to escape oppression under patriarchy is insulting and provably untrue. Yet, this is what ideas like gender identity and gender expression communicate. If we say that a man is a woman because of something as vague as a feeling, or because he chooses to take on stereotypically feminine traits, what impact does that have on women's rights and protections? Should he be allowed to apply for positions and grants specifically reserved for women, based on the knowledge that women are underrepresented or marginalized in male-dominated fields, and based on the fact that women are paid less than men and often will be fired or not hired in the first place because they get pregnant or because it is assumed that they may become pregnant one day. The way men feel on the inside does not change that they hold power and privilege in this society, and the way women feel on the inside doesn't change their experience of sexism. I don't feel as though I should be called misogynist names, objectified, abused, or sexually harassed, but these things have happened to me anyway. I did not choose to be treated like a woman under patriarchy, and I have never felt comfortable with femininity. Does this make me a man? Dissolving the categories of man and woman to allow for fluidity may sound progressive, but is no more progressive under the current circumstances than saying race doesn't exist and that white people don't hold privilege in this world if they don't feel white, or if they take on racist stereotypes attached to people of color. If a white person did this, we would rightly call it co-optation and denounce the behavior. Why do we accept that if a man takes on sexist stereotypes traditionally associated with women, he can magically change sex and shed his status as male in this world? The rights of women and girls are being pushed aside to accommodate a trend. Bill C-16 may sound persuasive in its efforts to be open-minded and inclusive, but it rests on very shaky ground. I implore you to further consider the consequences and implications of these ideas, this language, and this legislation before jumping on this bandwagon.
Thank you. Mr. Dirks.
I consider it a great privilege to speak to you today, honourable senators, in opposition to Bill C-16. I believe this bill to be well-intentioned, and yet it puts women and children at risk of sexual violence, and perhaps more importantly, removes a woman's right of consent when it comes to her bodily privacy. Our campaign has done hundreds of hours of research on male violence against women in public spaces. We have logged 255 incidents of the sort that many people say do not exist. These are largely of voyeurism in spaces like unisex change rooms at pools, gender-neutral bathrooms, or in 29 cases, situations where males have expressed a female gender and perpetrated violence in women's safe spaces. Let me give you a few examples only from Canada. In 2012, Christopher, or Jessica Hambrook, assaulted 2 women in Toronto shelters, in at least one case after 3 weeks of identifying as a woman. Darren Cottrell in 2013 dressed as a woman and committed voyeurism in a women's washroom at Dufferin Mall in Toronto. In 2015, Xingchen Liu dressed as a woman and committed video voyeurism in a women's change room at Leduc Recreation Centre in Edmonton. Also in 2015, the University of Toronto faced a debacle when they were forced to reverse their decision to make many of their washrooms gender neutral when at least 2 women were victims of voyeurism while they were showering. We recently did a geographical analysis of these incidents. We compared the level of incidents per population in those regions which had gender-inclusive legislation, which those that did not. Regions with gender legislation were 1.8 times as likely to have these violent incidents against women than those without. All 5 of the regions with the highest incident rate per population were those with gender legislation, with Ontario being the second out of all states, provinces, and territories. The best data we have available demonstrates that gender-inclusive legislation is associated with increased harm to women. Target stores make for an interesting case study which corroborates this finding. It is well known that in April 2016, Target publicized its gender-inclusive policy. In the 13 months since, Target has experienced 8 incidents of sexual violence against women in the change rooms and washrooms of their stores. This was more than all other years combined. One of the most notable of these incidents occurred in July 2016 in Idaho. Shauna Smith, a trans woman, one of few represented in our database, videotaped an 18-year-old woman changing. At Smith's sentencing, the judge stated, "I perhaps, along with others, thought that Target has now adopted a questionable policy and wondered, is someone going to come in and victimize someone because of that? You took advantage of that and victimized this young lady." But not only do women have the right to be protected in their safe spaces, they have a right of consent concerning their bodily privacy in places like change rooms. Stanley v. the RCMP 1987 states, "We cannot conceive of a more basic subject of privacy than the naked body. The desire to shield one's unclothed figure from view of strangers, and particularly strangers of the opposite sex, is impelled by elementary self-respect and personal dignity." Stops v. Just Ladies Fitness in 2006 states, "Privacy interests are not determined by the lowest common denominator of modesty that society considers appropriate. What is determinative is whether a reasonable person would find that person's claimed privacy interest legitimate and sincere, even though not commonly held." Bill C-16 removes women's right of consent concerning their bodily privacy and overturns decades of jurisprudence on bodily privacy law. This is likely why a majority of Canadians do not support full choice for trans bathroom access. An Angus Reid poll in 2016 found that while 84% of Canadians approve of transgender rights generally, as do I, only 41% supported full transgender bathroom rights. It is highly likely that support for change room access would be considerably less. Honourable Senators, we need more protections for women, not less. And above all, women must retain the right of consent concerning their bodily privacy. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving to questions, beginning with Deputy Chair Senator Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for their presentations. Change rooms and pools and so on, of course, come under the jurisdiction of the provinces, and they've had this legislation there for years. Of course, any act of violence is punishable under the criminal code. In other words, I think what you're saying is that you're maintaining that the provinces have made an error in implementing the legislation they've had since, some of them, 1985. And I presume that's your point. I see you're nodding. Let me ask Ms. Kerner a question. You represent the Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter. Is this the same organization that was before the BC Court of Appeal
Yes.
in Nixon versus Vancouver Rape Relief?
Yes, this is us.
Yes. Are you unhappy with what the British Columbia Court of Appeal had ruled, and the appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada was refused, was denied on the decision of the Court of Appeal, which overturned the trial judge's decision in that case? As I recall, the ruling was in favor of your center.
It's true. The first round, the Human Rights Tribunal, I assume people understand what the case that the senator is asking? No.
Yes, all the senators would, yes.
So would you like me to explain? So Nixon was born a male, and at the age of 33 had a sex reassignment surgery, and a few years after wanted to volunteer with us and joined. They came to an interview with our training group, and the facilitator explained Nixon that because the core relations that we have with women, we have peer relationship with women based on our shared experience as born females and raised as girls into womanhood, and we will not train or accept people who did not live their whole life as a female. And Nixon made a complaint to the Human Rights Tribunal in British Columbia that for many years now, before the new definition, accepted transgender under the criteria of sex. And the Human Rights Tribunal ruled that Rape Relief did discriminate Nixon and awarded them $7,500. Rape Relief took the case to judicial review. The Supreme Court of British Columbia judgment was that the Human Rights Tribunal erred, made a mistake, and Rape Relief has not been discriminating Nixon. And under the freedom of association, we are allowed to organize for the purpose of fighting for equality of oppressed group. We have the permission to define who are the members of our group are. Nixon appealed to BC Court of Appeal that reinforced the judgment of BC Supreme Court and agreed that we have not discriminated Nixon. And when Nixon appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, Supreme Court dismissed it.
So you were happy with
we were satisfied. It was a very painful process, 12 years.
That was under provincial law.
Yeah.
But it was under the definition of sex, I think.
It's true. Now yes. The BC.
But it's the same issue that we're addressing here.
It's true, yes. But Senator, if you paid careful attention to my presentation, we do not object that trans people not only will be protected as they are, probably there is a room because the legislator understands there is a particular harm done to transgender people to protect them. But the way the law goes about it is a problem, not the intention, not the hope that the law would like to create. And in British Columbia, the government passed in one day, there was no room for consultation last year, definitions that include gender identity and gender expression. They were not needed technically because the Human Rights Tribunal did hear cases, and it's true for the Federal Human Rights Tribunal. The Human Rights Tribunal accepted cases of transgender people without those definitions, so they formally have been protected before.
Thank you. Senator Platt.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Murphy, my question is for you. Dr. Saad was just here. I'm not sure whether you were in the room, and hopefully, of course, you will be treated a little nicer than he was. But he attributes the difference between men and women and femininity and masculinity to evolution and biological differences. You are here today making the case that gender is a social construct and imposed upon us through socialization. You are both experts in your own right, and what this tells me, and I think you've said it, is that there is still a lot to talk about with respect to gender. One major problem with this bill is that it prematurely shuts down this debate. So you raise an interesting point with respect to the access of transgender women or potentially even gender-fluid individuals to jobs or grants reserved for women. I find it interesting that a government who focuses so much energy on 50-50 quotas for men and women with blatantly binary categories is putting forward legislation that enshrines the theory of a gender spectrum into law. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons, or that's one of the places where gender identity and women's sex-based protections come into conflict. So it's often claimed that there is no conflict and it's just about protecting transgender people. And transgender people should be protected under the Human Rights Code, and I believe they already are, in fact. But women are still an oppressed class of people in this country, in this world, and that's solely due to biology. And once we start writing into legislation things like gender identity and gender expression, it can trump and has the potential to trump women's rights.
Could you elaborate a little bit on your position on the feminist perspective on the importance of women's-only spaces?
So, I mean, the feminist, this is kind of actually a long story, but the feminist movement, you know, the second wave feminist movement that began in the late 60s happened because women were able to gather together and talk about their shared experiences of oppression. It was called consciousness raising, and that's why the women's liberation movement started, was because women were able to get together only with other females and talk about what was happening to them in their lives, at work, at home, with their partners, their husbands, etc., their experiences of rape, abuse as women. You know, it's pivotal. We can't organize. We can't organize as a class of people, as women, as an oppressed class of people, if we can't meet with only other women. And, you know, this is a right that all marginalized groups should have. You know, people of color should be able to meet with just people of color to organize for their rights and their protections, and women should have that right also.
And this bill would put that in jeopardy?
I believe so.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Senator Jaffer.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to all three of you for your presentations. And I want to recognize Ms. Kerner because I come from Vancouver, and the kind of work you do, when I'm desperate to find shelter, you're always coming through for people. So I want to recognize the tremendous work you do. Ms. Kerner, I listened to you very carefully, and I know what the shelter stands for. So, and also for Ms. Murphy, maybe, neither of you are saying that we should not protect trans people, right? This is to protect, of three of you, I don't think you're saying we should not have protection for trans people, right? Am I correct on that?
Of course, and there is no debate that transgender people in British Columbia and probably all over the country do need shelters, do need support services, do need protection. I am just saying, behalf of my group, the right for protection need to be carefully carved so they will not interfere with the protection of female-born women, the organizing with female-born women, our fight for our liberation.
But the Nixon case covered that. So
it's true. We are protected, but I also think you are aware of the situation in Vancouver, Senator Jaffer, because we were protected, we have our autonomy, but surely you know the witch hunt that goes against my group. The BC Federation of Labor just instructed all their affiliated unions to boycott Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelters, the oldest rape crisis center in Canada, because even though the Supreme Court of BC agreed that we allow to work only with female-born women, we are deemed to be transphobic. And that's the danger of a legislation that is not explicitly protecting the right of women to organize.
So, you know, there are two issues here. One is the very basic issue of forgiving, and that's what we are looking at, is the very basic issue of protecting trans people, whether, you know, like we as women have flourished because somebody before us gave us the protection. As people of color have flourished, as people gave us protection. And as we are evolving, we must make sure trans people are protected so that they flourish in society as women and people of color have flourished. And I know, Ms. Kerner, you would not disagree with that, with everything. So
the heart will disagree
yeah, and
with
so,
that.
And that's what, for me, this bill says. And
I understand. There is no debate. I think there is consensus, at least on behalf of my group. We're not challenging the intention of the legislation. We're just saying there is no consensus on the very basic terminology. You have such an important role in Canadian democracy to foster public conversation. Don't rush the bill. Invite many, many witnesses, feminist legal scholars, so we can carefully craft a legislation that do exactly what you want with protecting other groups.
Senator Dagenet.
Monsieur le Président, ma question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is to Ms. Murphy. Can you hear me, Ms. Murphy? Can you hear me well? Channel 1 is the English channel. Channel 1 is the English channel. This 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 is the English channel. Can you hear me? This is the English channel. This is the English channel. Ms. Murphy, in the light of the testimony we've heard, it's clear that there's no consensus on the definition of gender. Can you give us some examples of the impact that the bill might have when you talk about confusion and the kind of gender identity that shouldn't be targeted by C-16, particularly in the workplace?
I'm not exactly clear on the question, but I mean, I think what I'm speaking to, primarily, again, is this language and this idea that we should be writing the idea of gender identity and gender expression into the Human Rights Code, and the fact that, again, gender isn't a real thing. Like, this isn't a quantifiable thing. There's no way of determining whose gender identity is what, because gender isn't an identity. It's not something inside. It's just sexist ideas. That's all that it is. It's sexist stereotypes that are imposed on people. And, you know, so I take issue with the idea that this exists in the first place. I think that it's harmful to women because I think that it could be potentially argued that women are born feminine. You know, if I'm born female and I say I'm a woman, what does that mean? Does that mean that I identify with those sexist stereotypes, that I identify with femininity? And femininity to me is oppression. That's an idea that justifies my oppression and the oppression of women and girls everywhere. So, I mean, that's my main problem with this bill. I don't know if that answers your question at all.
Merci, Madame. Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you. Senator Pratt.
I'm interested to know a little bit more about where your data comes from. If I understand correctly, the 255 incidents that you have compiled are all incidents that happened in non-sex segregated spaces from something like 2009 to today. That's about it, right?
A little further, but yes.
Okay. Now, if my calculations are correct, about 90% of those incidents were committed by males who were expressing as males.
Yes, correct.
That's correct. So that doesn't have much to do with transgender people, right?
No, that's incorrect. And for this reason, it's a very good question. People have been making pro-protections advocates have been making the case for quite some time that transgender people do not pose a special threat, but rather that male predators who will take advantage of these spaces do. And so this is precisely what the number of incidences show, a tremendous amount of examples of that. And so when you relax the protections of women in the places where they are the most vulnerable and unclothed, it creates opportunities. And if you want, I'd be happy to share with you an example of a sexual perpetrator. It's very graphic of how he goes about. But these kinds of, there are many examples.
But unisex spaces have existed for a long time, even before we even talked about transgender people. Now, something else, have you computed the same kind of data as to the number of incidents that happened in sex-segregated spaces during that same period of time?
No, I don't have that analysis.
So we have no basis of comparison as to whether how many incidents happened in sex-segregated spaces during that same period of time.
Here's the relevancy, Senator.
No, would you just please, do we have that basis of comparison?
I've already answered. I don't have that basis of comparison.
Okay, and I have a last question.
But can I answer the question? Chair, can I answer the question?
Yes, I will ask my last question and then you can answer. I would also like to know whether we have a basis of comparison as to in those same states or provinces, whether we can compare the statistics before gender legislation was adopted and after as to the number of incidents that happened.
Okay. Thank you, Senator.
Go ahead.
To answer the last question first, I'm not certain that we have the amount of incidents. As you know, as probably most of you know, when you start to run studies, you need a certain amount of data to be able to do the right kinds of calculations, and that the less data you have, the less reliable, of course, your findings. So there is not the data to be able to do the kinds of regressions that you're asking for, although I would love for that data to be available. But the second question as to relevancy is absolutely key because of this, that in these spaces there's no way for a woman to know whether she is in jeopardy. Because when she's unclothed, if there is no way for her to know that somebody should be there or not. And so you've got examples of women being kicked out of women's shelters because they objected to having it. So in the Okanagan, BC, recently, 2017, being kicked out of women's shelters because they objected to having a male who identified as a woman in their space where they're unclothed. We've got all sorts of examples where people are being where there's these predators are getting in and being. I mean, we could multiply.
There always have been predators, and I would submit that your data is not scientifically reliable.
We'll have to leave it there. Move on to Senator Frum.
Chair, a witness on the previous panel, Theryn Meyer, made a suggestion that the term transsexual status would be a more precise use of language than gender identity or gender expression. And I'd like to ask Ms. Kerner and Ms. Murphy if it was possible to amend the legislation by replacing the terms gender identity and gender expression with a term such as transsexual status. Would that be an improvement in your opinion, or would you still think the bill needs to be further studied?
No, definitely the bill needs further studies. There are brilliant feminists across this country who did not have a chance to be heard, to have your opinion, and we should have their wisdom. But if at all, just a very quick response, one possibility is to add, there is, in the ground discrimination, there is an undernote saying that when it comes to pregnancy or childbirth, it will deem under sex. And one possibility is to say when the ground of discrimination is when a person's behavior is not conform or consistent with the social expectation of that person's sex, that discrimination should be deemed to be on the ground of sex, which is how de facto the Human Rights Tribunal federally and provincially have been interpreting the law. And then we do not get to all kind of definition or set of minds that is not clear and not agreed on in the Canadian society. We know that transgender people are harmed because they're behaving in a way that is not complying with their sex. It's actually a factual thing, materialistic thing, and that behavior should never be condemned. We as women want the freedom not to behave as a way of the confining messages about femininity, and all people should have that freedom.
Quickly, Chair, if I may. So in terms of the consultation process for this bill, was your group consulted? You don't feel the feminist community was adequately consulted by the minister or at the House
Not
committee?
at all. On the contrary, we do appreciate that the committee, in the very last minute, accommodated to our pleading to be heard. But we had to fight to get into the door, and we're just to this. Yeah, have not been consulted in the Parliament.
Okay.
Thank you.
Senator Pate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much to all of you for attending. And I want to thank in particular Ms. Murphy and Ms. Kerner for the work that you've done in the feminist community for many, many years. And also to echo Senator Jaffer, I'd like Ms. Kerner, you to take back to your collective appreciation on behalf of many women, not just women escaping violence, but you've taken in women from prison, women who have come as refugees, some of the first women who later were some of the missing and murdered Indigenous women, and the work you've done to assist other shelters in developing and over time, and to promote women's equality more generally. So thank you for that work. And would you be willing to provide the definition that you just identified? The question I was going to ask, you've sort of made me think of that now, but the question I was going to ask is we've asked through the committee for an opinion from the Department of Justice about if a case came up again, like the case that you faced, and it was within the federal jurisdiction, what would happen in terms of gender and sex discrimination discussions and opinions, and if you were assured that you would still be able to permit and self-organize, would your concerns about this bill be alleviated if we get that opinion back from Justice?
Well, as I mentioned, there is a particular legality and there is a social consensus, social treatment. And I did mention the boycotts that Vancouver people is suffering, but I also want to say that because we've been around for so long, we respond to 1,200 women escaping male violence every year. We shelter at least 100 better women in our house with their children. So we do have a lot of support in Vancouver community, and we're sustaining ourselves beyond this boycott or any other attempt to undermine us. But the purpose of a law, particularly this kind of law, is not just about the legality. It's to set a worldview. It's to set a concept. And a concept that says that it doesn't matter what sex you were born into, which is really a wonderful concept in theory, completely dismiss the reality of women's oppression. So we better fight women's oppression. We better understand how it plays, not just around the world. We know in some places, babies, girls are being murdered as soon as they were born. But also in our own country, a woman is being murdered by her male partner almost at least once a week. We know about the violence against Indigenous women. We're not in the world yet. The gender confinement to sex does not matter.
Right. Just supplementary, I know that that rape relief in the crisis line that you operate does work with transgendered individuals, men and women, who call the line. And you mentioned that there's a need for some resources there. Are there other ways that we could be looking at this that might assist in ensuring those resources and supports are available for individuals who are now getting the support through your crisis line?
So, of course, we are human with a heart, and we will never turn away someone who is not safe. We will secure anybody who called us. We will secure safety. But if transgender people are actually interested in the service that rape relief offered to women, then it will be wise to create a service that is designed by transgender people, offered by transgender people, to transgender people, so there is a full understanding of the experience of people's life and relation and support from that place. But in general, we are lacking of services. There are not even enough services to female-born women. We have to turn away so many women all the time, and it's true for other transition houses. So more services to all, and definitely if the legislator want to protect transgender people, there should be designated services for transgender people. Thank you.
Okay. Senator Batters.
Thanks very much, all of you, for coming today. Ms. Murphy, as you likely know, this bill is not the same as the previous bill from the last Parliament that we dealt with. This bill not only includes gender identity as a protected ground, but also gender expression. And do you consider the term gender expression to be vague? And from your feminist point of view, what is your perspective on that particular term?
I do consider it to be vague. I consider both terms to be vague. And I think that the point that Hilla made was really important, which is that what we're still talking about is sex-based protection, and what we should be defending is the right of people, regardless of whether they're born female or male, to be, gender non-conforming, right? To not fit into these stereotypes that I talked about earlier. As I've said, this language is a really big problem because it treats gender as a personal choice. It treats gender as though it's the clothes that I wear, or makeup, or behavior. These things that are all enforced on us through socialization. The way we sit, there's these issues that feminists talk about all the time, things like manspreading, which is, it's sort of a silly word, but it's about the way that men take up space in public places. And that's something that's socialized, that's something that's learned. So a male learns to feel comfortable taking up space, whereas a woman learns to take up as little space as possible, to be polite, to be accommodating, not to set boundaries. And I really don't want to start building legislation around those ideas that, if you're a male and you behave in a way that's traditionally associated with femininity, then that must mean you're a woman, because that's not what it means to be a woman.
So given what you just said, would you say then that including gender expression even exacerbates the issue from what the previous bill did? Including gender expression in addition to gender identity, it may exacerbate some of these stereotypes and that sort of thing, and focusing simply on the expression of gender as opposed to anything else.
Yeah, I do, because I think that it legitimizes these ideas, and it treats something that is systemic oppression as something that is personal, about personal feelings, personal expressions. Does this mean that women are raped because they look feminine? Does it mean that women are abused because they're too passive? It's just a really, really dangerous path to go down, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Ahmedvar.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for your testimony. My question is for Mr. Dirks. Would you agree that anyone can commit voyeurism?
The statistics are that voyeurism and exhibitionism are almost completely dominated by males, upwards of 98%, probably greater. I've personally gone through state sexual offender records. High-risk sex offenders are almost always male. Again, right around the 98% mark, but also fantasies of voyeurism. And Abel, 1988, in his study, and Templeman, 1991 in his study, show that males sometimes are, in the sample that Templeman had in 1991 found that 40% had engaged in voyeurism of males. That's a tremendous statistic. And in another study that Templeman cites, that upwards of 40% had fantasized about voyeurism and others about pedophilia and rape. These are criminal patterns that do not exist amongst women. They don't. There are significant, and the magnitude of differences between male and female on these kinds of things is enormous. And so there's some very important things that need to be in place when it comes to sex segregation to protect women and girls.
Quick follow-up, Chair.
Yes.
Do you have evidence that voyeurism and similar crimes are more likely to be committed by transgendered people versus women or men? I think you've sort of answered that.
There is no pro-protections advocate that I'm aware of that argues that trans women are more dangerous than other women as a group. But there is one piece of evidence that's really important in this, and that is that there exists amongst trans women certain criminal patterns that do not exist at all amongst women. So for instance, at the earlier part of this year, there was a sex offender, Antoine Nascathy, who was out on the loose in Vancouver, who was gender variant and sometimes identified himself as female. He was convicted for breaking into homes and sexually assaulting female residents between 2001 and 2009. It's an example of a criminal pattern that simply does not exist amongst women, where a woman would break into a home and perpetrate sexual violence against other women. Matthew, or as now known, Madeline Harks, would be another example where she has claimed to victimize 60 girls. So there's tremendous sex differences that need to be taken into account here. No one is saying that trans people are more dangerous, and yet there are patterns amongst trans women that do not exist amongst women.
So I'm not, may I? I'm not clear whether that is a series of anecdotes or evidence.
That is personal accounts, and there is, there are personal things that are happening right now. In 2017, earlier on, you had somebody that was on the loose that women should have been scared of in their safe spaces, that if only females were allowed into their spaces, they had no need to be afraid of.
Final, thank you, Chair, you're being very kind. We heard in last week's testimony that in fact transgender people are more likely to be victims of crime than other groups.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. In 2015, the greatest survey done on trans individuals in the States surveyed 27,700 trans individuals across every state. They found that 1% of trans individuals were victims of sexual assault in bathrooms, and 0.6% were victims of sexual assault in bathrooms. It may be that there's overlap between those two numbers. I repudiate those kinds of incidents. They're horrifying, and yet one must be aware that 1.6%, even if you add those two numbers together, of a population that's 0.6%, so 1.6 of 0.6 is a very small group of people.
Okay, moving on, Senator Joyal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm listening carefully to your reasoning, Ms. Murphy and Kerner, and frankly, I have a problem with it on the basis of principle. You start from the principle, from the facts that women have been discriminated, oppressed, impose, a way of being, way of dressing and whatnot to keep them vulnerable to the man as a predator. And then you say, well, transgender who identify as a woman are not in fact real women. They can't think as a woman, they don't have the sex of a woman, and even though they identify to the society that impose on them a certain way of behavior, in fact, they'll never be women. So they are not of us, they should be away, in another group, in another services, in another way of dealing with them if they have social problem and whatnot. I have a problem with that, because we would be creating in the law another discrimination on a group of persons that is more discriminated than women have been discriminated, and we're fighting against that. My colleagues are all around the table fight against that in their way and capacity. So that's why I miss to establish the connection that a transgender woman is not a woman, and we don't want her among us. Mr. Dick says, oh, she will be threatening, you know, she will be spying, looking, she might assault us, aggress us, and whatnot. I think that we have to be very careful when we establish categories of peoples to be sure that we don't use anecdotes to maintain discrimination or find a way out of addressing the problem front and center. That's where I wrestle with your reasoning. I'm not sure that I would, I would adopt it 100%. As much as I say, I would fight, tooth and nail against, oppression of women in whatsoever sort.
That's reassuring. It's good to know. Senator, I don't know if transgender people are more oppressed than women or more discriminated, and I don't want to go to the competition of who suffered more. I do think a lot of people suffer. There is no debate about women's oppression all over the world and here in Canada, and I don't want to be in a position of asserting something that's already established in Canadian society. But I don't know how you define the woman. Surely it's not a lifestyle. And what we're saying is, what we're saying is, if you were born a female, you are doomed. You are doomed in our society to be a second class. You do not have the privilege of growing as a male and have a choice to choose to be a woman. Surely you cannot say these are the same things.
Well, you say when you're born a woman, you are under harsher conditions. Let's put it in the broadest possible term. But if you are a person who identifies psychologically, personally, clothing, way of doing, all the factors of identification you can imagine, and come public and say, I am a woman and I assume the conditions of women. I assume the condition of discrimination of women, because a transgender woman is not another woman. She has exactly the same women's status than any of the other women. So that's why I have some problems to say she's less discriminated than
I don't want to go there. I do not think it's wise to say who is more or less oppressed. And I have not used anecdotal, but the concrete example that Vancouver Rape Relief has dealt with is a person who was born male, had the privilege that being a male and being a man gave this person. They were a pilot, successful pilot, before choosing to become a woman. So it's a different life experience. And I think what we're disagreeing is you have not been convinced that once you were born a female, you are forced to an oppressed class. I think we have a principal debate. And it might be because you're not a pro-feminist, or it might be because you're a man, but we are still in a world that when you're born a female, you are born to be a second class. And the anecdotal cases that we have of successful women are actually, they are anecdotal, because if you will see the majority of women in the world, they have less. The level of violence against girls and women are much higher. Poverty, discrimination in every area of life. So it is not the same as being born to be of the oppressing class, to be born with privilege. And the internal feeling and the assuming and the appropriation cannot mitigate or undermine the fact that society does give privilege to men.
Yeah, but if
No, I'm sorry. I'm afraid we've run out of time, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here this evening and assisting the committee in its deliberations. Much appreciated. Meeting adjourned.